Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Lindsey. I'm the Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. For those of you who have been here for the 2 days of the symposium, thank you very much for your attendance. For those of you who have just joined us for today, thank you as well for braving the weather this morning and coming out. It's my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker. When I first started as Commissioner in March of 2011, there had been a report which had been published, and it was entitled Uneven Pain. And within the report, it identified the largest disparities between whites and African Americans in unemployment rates. And it sent a shockwave through the Twin Cities because in a state in which we long pride ourselves as excelling in many areas, this was in one area where we were not excelling. And unfortunately, we're number one on the list, but number one for the wrong reason. And that being we had the greatest disparities between whites and African Americans. It served as a wake-up call for city leaders, state leaders, business leaders, education leaders to make sure that we had career pathways to ensure all of us could be included. And as a Commissioner of Human Rights, in particular, I paid attention within the report of a holistic view of the problem ahead of us. Many sometimes would say education would be the issue. Others would say barriers, and that's a euphemism for discrimination or disparate outcomes. And it was really important and incumbent upon us to look at both and not to stay in our silos and only look at one. So for me personally, it is a great honor and privilege because I will say I have cited early and often to your work in trying to move the conversation forward here within the state of Minnesota. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Algernon Austin to the stage. Dr. Austin.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Commissioner Lindsey. It's an honor to be with you here today. And I'm so happy that report, I'm just getting set up here. I'm so happy that report has been so useful to Minneapolis and Minnesota. But it really, the report was only part of the story. A big part of the story is due to the work of Commissioner Lindsey, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, and a whole number of community and activist organizations in Minneapolis, St. Paul. So congratulations to you all for taking that report and running with it and making positive change based on it. So it really is an honor to speak with you all today. I also have to commend the Commissioner and the Minnesota Department of Human Rights for putting this event together. It's a great event, and I learned it has a very long history, and it's wonderful that the state is really taking a leadership role in addressing these issues. Before I get into the meat of my presentation, I want to say that I'm speaking today for myself and not as a representative of any particular organization. And with that, let me get to my main topic, which is thinking about where we are. And here we are, 9 years after the election of Barack Obama as President of the United States. 9 years since America became post-racial. How would you say we're doing at being a post-racial America? Isn't it great that we no longer have to worry about racism? It may be hard to remember today, but with the election of Barack Obama, many people declared America post-racial. So Senator John McCain, his opponent in the 2008 election, in his concession speech stated, "I've always believed that America offers opportunities to all who have industry and will to seize it. America today is a world away from the cruel and prideful bigotry of the Jim Crow era. There is no better evidence of this than the election of an African American to the presidency of the United States. So that was John McCain's response. And others had made similar statements. The NPR news analyst, Daniel Schorr, argued that Obama's campaign successes signaled the emergence of a post-racial era where civil rights veterans of the past century are consigned to history, and Americans begin to make race-free judgments on who should lead them. The African-American Harvard University professor, Henry Louis Gates Jr., declared that the election was the symbolic culmination of the Black freedom struggle, the grand achievement of a great collective dream. The African-American journalist, Janetta Rose Barris, claimed that with Barack Obama's ascension to the highest office in the United States, most African-Americans feel that we have arrived as fully equal citizens. And perhaps one young California woman put it best when she argued, at this point, the whole race thing is over. It doesn't matter anymore. We've transcended it. Now we have a Black president, so clearly we are not racist. So that was the view 9 years ago, and here we are, 9 years into a post-racial America, and how are we doing? This year in Charlottesville, Virginia, neo-Nazis, Ku Klux Klan members, and white supremacists of various flavors chanted the Nazi slogan, blood and soil, while carrying torches. They also chanted, "You will not replace us," based on the notion that white people and white culture are under attack by Jews and people of color. This chant morphed into, "Jews will not replace us." So again, here we are. How are we doing? This symposium is about creating a more perfect union. That's a great goal, but it's clear that we still have a lot of work to do to be a unified country where racism is a thing of the past. It's important to revisit that moment in 2008 when we declared America post-racial, because it really reveals a lot about the challenges we face in creating a more perfect union. How was it that so many smart and concerned people could be so wrong about where we are in the struggle against racism? It's important to understand this because if people can't see the racism that exists, then of course, they aren't going to be very effective in addressing it. You don't spend time, energy, and resources on a problem you don't think you have. Today, the awareness of racial discrimination is high, but this is not the first time in history that we've had this awareness. In the 1960s, Americans recognized racism as a major problem confronting the society. But by the 1980s, people were already making arguments that we were rapidly moving towards a post-racial America. In the 1990s, many people saw the beating of Rodney King by several police officers, then the acquittal of those police officers from any charges, and then the rioting in Los Angeles. And once again, people recognize that we have a serious problem with racism in American society. That's the mid-1990s. And then by the election of Barack Obama in 2008, once again, people were declaring America post-racial. So today, we again see racism as a big problem, but where will we be a decade from now? Will we be devoting the time, the energy, and the resources necessary to address the problem, or will we be declaring America post-racial again? In 2015, I published this book, America is Not Post-Racial, Xenophobia, Islamophobia, Racism in the 44th President, to try to understand the intense hatred of Barack Obama, but also to try to understand why people were declaring America post-racial. As I analyzed the issue, I found that there were many errors made in declaring America post-racial. And one error was simply a misunderstanding of the vote count. So Barack Obama received 53% of the votes cast in 2008. This was a majority of the votes cast, but it is not 100%. What about the other 47%? Are the 47% of voters who did not vote for Barack Obama post-racial? But wait a minute. Obama received 53% of the votes cast, but what percent of voting age adults actually voted? One of the problems we have in our democracy is low voter participation in elections. Only 57% of the voting age population voted in the 2008 election. Obama received a little more than half of the 57% of voters who voted. And when you examine it carefully, you find that he only received votes from 29% of the voting age population. So after 29% of the voting age population voted for Obama, people rapidly declared America post-racial. What about the 71% of Americans who did not vote for Obama? It's clear that the people who declared America post-racial weren't seriously thinking about the 71% of voters. Another issue that's a little more serious is, what does voting for a candidate mean? The idea that the election meant that America is post-racial rested on the idea that a vote for Obama is an indication that the voter is post-racial. But is that true? Let's think about it. Do people vote for candidates while not liking things about that candidate? And I would say yes. As a matter of fact, I can't recall ever voting for someone who I was 100% on board with. There's usually some issue or something that I'm less than thrilled about with my candidates. Do people vote for candidates not because they like the candidate, but because they think the candidate's opponent is even worse than the candidate? And yes, and that's why you hear about the lesser of two evils, right? I hate candidate A, but I hate candidate B more. So I then vote for candidate A. So were some people voting for Obama as an endorsement of post-racialism, or did people vote for Obama in spite of his blackness? Sociologists know that people can have different levels of comfort with people of a particular race in different situations. For example, it's possible for someone to work with members of a particular race, and it looks like it's a fairly harmonious relationship, but that person can still feel like, I don't want people from that racial group living in my neighborhood, and I don't want them marrying into my family. So what did voting for Barack Obama mean? Did it mean that the voter was committed to being post-racial in all aspects of life? Or was the voter post-racial just in the voting booth? My research and the research of others show that there are people with strong anti-Black attitudes, strong anti-Black prejudices, who voted for Barack Obama. So for example, a canvasser went up to a door and asked a man living there who he intended to vote for. This is in 2008. And the man responded, "Ma'am, we're voting for the nigger." So this voter, although he voted for Barack Obama, probably was not post-racial. Another said, when asked again, who are you going to vote for, said that, or was explaining why he was voting for Obama. He says, "I've got to vote for him." And he admitted, "I'm not crazy about him. I don't know. Maybe because he's Black." And of course, if someone says that they don't like someone, maybe because they're Black, it's because they're Black. The political scientist Charles Franklin found that of people with strong anti-Black attitudes, in his analysis, more than 20% of those voters said that they were going to vote for Barack Obama. In my analysis, using a different data set and a slightly different methodology, I found that about 30% of individuals with a high level of anti-Black prejudice voted for Barack Obama in 2008. So it may be difficult to understand this, but I think we too often think of people, in this case of voters with anti-Black prejudice, as being fairly simple-minded and single issue. And one thing that I would like us to do is try to think with a little bit more complexity about what prejudice looks like in the society. But one way that this logic of being anti-Black and voting for Obama worked was that not everyone sees Obama as Black. So the Obama campaign made it clear and publicized the fact that Obama has a white mother and was raised by white grandparents. And so many people see Obama as biracial and not Black. On the other hand, Barack Obama identifies as Black, and the historic pattern in the United States has been that if someone has a white parent and a Black parent, they're Black. Many people with an appearance similar to Barack Obama are considered Black, and many African Americans have white ancestry. So there's a good case for seeing Obama as Black. On the other hand, since the 1990s, there's been a multiracial, biracial movement that has pushed for recognizing people with parents who have of different races as biracial or multiracial. So it's possible for Americans to see Barack Obama as Black, and it's possible for Americans to see Barack Obama as biracial. And we know that this distinction mattered for some voters. So for example, one woman, a lifelong Democrat, struggled with the idea of voting for a Black man for president. Finally, her sister convinced her. And she reports, "My sister said, 'You don't understand. He's white too. He has a white mom and white grandparents.' And she says, 'That had a lot to do with me voting for Obama.'" At least some Obama campaign volunteers used this strategy to move people to support Obama. A volunteer reported, "If this issue, Obama's race, comes up, even if obliquely, I emphasize that Obama is from a multiracial background and that his father was an African intellectual, not an American from the inner city. I explained that Obama has never aligned himself solely with African American interests, not on any issue, but rather has always sought to find a middle ground." Another Obama campaign volunteer reports telling a prejudiced voter, "One thing you have to remember is that Obama, he's half white, and he was raised by his white mother, so his views are more white than black, really." A survey done in 2010 found a slight majority of Americans, 52%, see Obama as biracial. Only 27% categorize him as black, and the remainder see him as either both, neither, or they don't know how to classify him. So one way people could have anti-black attitudes and vote for Barack Obama is to see him as biracial. And for these people, being black-white biracial is distinct from and superior to being black, being African American. Another way that someone could vote for Obama and separate him from blackness is to see him as exceptional. So one white woman stated, "Obama's black characteristics, if you will, are not there. The way that African Americans speak, the way they behave, a lot of things about him radiate white, not black. And maybe that's why I don't even think about his race." So when someone views a black person as not really black, this way of thinking allows the person to remain uncritical about his or her anti-black biases and stereotypes while reacting positively to a particular black person. So again, what did the vote for Barack Obama mean? We cannot make conclusions about a person's racial attitudes based on this vote. We don't know how many Obama voters felt that although they could vote for Obama, they don't want black people to move into their neighborhood or to marry into their family. We don't know how many Obama voters didn't want to vote for him because of his race, but felt that he was the lesser of two evils. We don't know how many Obama voters could not vote for a black man, but could vote for Barack Obama because they saw him as biracial. We don't know how many Obama voters would not vote for black people generally, but could vote for Obama because they see him as not really black. When we consider all of these possibilities, we have to acknowledge that we don't know what the Obama votes meant in terms of racial attitudes. So one lesson we should take from this is that a person's attitude towards a particular individual of a racial or ethnic group cannot be assumed to be his or her attitude toward the group generally. Just because someone loves Obama, that does not mean that he or she loves black people. So those are some of the errors, but the most important error, I think the most significant error made in declaring America post-racial was the failure to look at the issue of institutional racial discrimination. Today, some people use the term systemic racism or structural racism or structural discrimination to refer to this concept. But basically, this concept refers to the broader, more widespread practices of discrimination that can be found in the day-to-day operations of institutions in American society. I often hear people say that the Brown versus Board of Education decision ended segregation in American schools. The Brown decision is a historic Supreme Court decision, and it inspired a great deal of civil rights activism, but it did not desegregate America's schools. Let me say that again. The Brown decision did not desegregate American schools. America's schools today are still segregated. They may not be quite as intensely segregated and may not be segregated by law as they were during the Jim Crow era, but they're still segregated by the normal day-to-day practices in society. One recent analysis stated, despite our country's growing diversity, our public schools provide little contact between white students and students of color. Although a majority of America's public school students are students of color, the average white student still attends a majority white school. A 2010 analysis of the 100 largest metropolitan areas found that in only two of the 100 metropolitan areas, in only 2 were black students integrated with white students. Note that this analysis is looking at the entire metropolitan area, not a specific school or school district, but the metro area. Of the 100 largest metropolitan areas, in only 1 metropolitan area were Latino students integrated with white students, only 1. Why does this matter? The report states, white students attend schools that are disproportionately white and low poverty. Black and Hispanic students attend schools that are disproportionately minority and high poverty. Children in high poverty schools face enormous challenges, with classmates who are generally less prepared, have lower aspirations and graduation rates, and have greater absences. Parents who are less involved, with less political and financial clout, and teachers who tend to be less experienced and more commonly teach outside their fields of concentration. On every measure of school quality, the average predominantly white school is of higher quality than the average predominantly Latino or predominantly black school. Americans see education as an important mechanism to provide economic opportunity and for upward mobility. But more than a half century after the Brown decision, we are still providing inferior education to students of color. This is one manifestation of institutional discrimination today. If we had our eye on institutional racial discrimination, we would have asked ourselves if the election of Barack Obama meant that we would finally desegregate our schools, or if we would see an end to discrimination in employment, or in the criminal justice system, or in other institutions in American society. If we were thinking about these things and understanding the strength of these day-to-day discriminatory practices, we would not have said that America is post-racial. And the failure to think about institutional discrimination in society was the biggest and most important error made in declaring America post-racial. So those are some of the errors made in declaring America post-racial. The question is, why did so many smart and concerned people make so many errors in thinking about racism in American society? If people can't see the problem of racial prejudice and discrimination in society, then they won't support a solution. Therefore, we need to understand what's blinding people to an awareness of prejudice and discrimination. Once we have that understanding, we can begin trying to craft a strategy to build support for the fight against racism and to more effectively work to create a more perfect union. I want to begin with two general difficulties that Americans have in seeing racial discrimination in American society. And these difficulties, I think, can affect people of all political stripes. Then I'll go to a problem that I think affects liberals more than conservatives, and then one that I think affects conservatives more than liberals. The first problem is simply that we're Americans. We identify as Americans, we love ourselves, and we love our country. Racism, for most Americans, is seen as a very bad thing. It is viewed very negatively, even among people with high levels of racial prejudice. This means that because we are Americans and we love America, we don't want to see America as bad, as a country struggling with racism. We are biased to see the good in the country and to downplay, diminish, and even completely ignore the bad. The better we can feel about America, the better we can feel about ourselves as Americans, and we want to feel good about ourselves. In addressing this challenge, I think we should make clear that we are not the only country with racial and ethnic discrimination. Sadly, to some degree, it can be found in all countries around the globe. Having a country with racial and ethnic discrimination does not make America uniquely bad in the world. We should also emphasize that, as this symposium is titled, we are trying to create a more perfect union. In working to address racism in American society, we are not simply trying to say bad things about the country. We're working to make it better. We're not trying to tear the country down. We're trying to build it up. We also need to take advantage of and to celebrate the anti-racism embedded in our American ideals. Our Declaration of Independence states, "All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So note that. All people are created equal and have a right to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. This is a very powerful and prominent statement of equality, of freedom, and of opportunity. The Pledge of Allegiance of the flag of the United States concludes with a call for liberty and justice for all. We should celebrate and be proud of the fact that we live in a country with these ideals. Equality, liberty, and justice for all people have not been valued in all places and at all times. It is great that we as Americans value these ideals, and we should point out that in fighting racism, we are working to make these ideals a reality. We are fighting for and celebrating American principles when we fight racism. So rather than us only saying that America is a society with institutional discrimination, we should also say that we are fighting for American ideals, for equality, for freedom, and for opportunity when we fight against racial discrimination. A second general problem relates to the difficulty we have in seeing institutional racial discrimination. Institutional discrimination is important because it's a mass phenomenon. When we talk about institutional discrimination, we're talking about practices that affect millions of people. However, we can't think about a mass phenomenon, we can't think about millions of people without dealing with statistics. And the problem is we're human beings, not statistics. We can easily see and talk about the actions of individuals and their effects. This is easy and natural for our minds to process. At the mass level, we have to move to more abstract concepts of probabilities and statistics. Probabilities and statistics are not easy and natural. Further, our history of our thinking about discrimination has been distorted by the popular history of the civil rights movement from the 1950s and 1960s. That history presents racists as angry, hateful people who have deep and uncontrollable animosities. The day-to-day, matter-of-fact nature of institutional discrimination is not like this. So I recall seeing a documentary. I don't remember too many of the specifics about it. But this was a documentary of an audit study or a paired tester study of discrimination in rental housing. And a paired tester study, they send one white tester out and a black tester out, paired together. So in this case, the black tester went to apply for an apartment that was advertised. The black person enters the rental office, and the person working in the office says, "Oh, I'm very sorry, that apartment is no longer available. Have a nice day. Good luck with your search." Sometime later, the white tester arrives and asks about this very same apartment, and the person says, "Sure, let me take you to see the apartment." So what's interesting here is, this is what discrimination looks like, right? It's not like what you saw in the documentaries about the civil rights movement. The black person did not know that he had been denied the opportunity to look at the apartment. He did not know that he had experienced discrimination. So we have a great deal of difficulty seeing and understanding the day-to-day, the impersonal, the casual discrimination that occurs in society. And one book that I want to recommend to you all who are interested in this topic to really think more deeply and more richly about institutional discrimination is Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law: The Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. And I think I found that very, very enlightening, and it goes into tremendous detail about understanding segregation in American society. And more broadly, I think it's very rich for understanding, thinking about how institutional discrimination works and what it looks like. So we're not used to thinking about racial discrimination that is the result of polite, matter-of-fact behaviors. But we can't understand institutional discrimination until we understand the power of impersonal policies and procedures to produce racial inequality. To address this challenge, we have to draw more attention to the fact of institutional discrimination in society over and over again. In a society where there's evidence of racial discrimination in all of our major institutions, we should not have people casually saying that we are post-racial. Unfortunately, this means that we have to talk about probabilities and statistics. There is no way around it. But we can and should use specific case studies of specific individuals to illustrate more general patterns. We also have to emphasize that our case is part of a more general pattern. Unfortunately, I've seen people use atypical cases, rare aberrant cases, to mislead people about what the general patterns are. So we have to link our cases back to the general patterns and get people more comfortable thinking about broad patterns in society. These two problems, one, our bias to see the positive and to downplay the negative about America, and two, the difficulty we have in seeing institutional discrimination, means that Americans typically grossly underestimate racial discrimination in the society. In other words, we're strongly biased to say that America is post-racial when it's not. If we wish to create a more perfect union, we need to find ways to counteract this bias. So there's also a problem that I think can disproportionately affect liberals. Anti-Black racial attitudes can be found among people of all political backgrounds, but they are more common, or at least more commonly expressed, among conservatives than among liberals. America is highly politically polarized today. Liberals tend to socialize only with liberals, and this means that it's easy for them to underestimate the extent of racist or prejudicial attitudes in America. So now I'm going to refer to what one woman discovered when she, during 2008, during the Obama campaign, and she's also a canvasser for the campaign. And the election led her to this conclusion. I didn't think that racism was so prevalent, but boy, the racist billboard signs and these racist laminated pages, it shows that in the rural county I live in, there is a race problem. I knew there was prejudice, but I didn't think it was to that extent. So although she lives in that community, the election and her canvassing really opened her eyes that it was a much deeper problem, much bigger problem than she believed. Another statement by a journalist in the same time period. In 2008, white people I have known my entire life confessed to me that they would not vote for Obama because of his race. They won't go on record. They will say otherwise in public. But in a comfortable environment over iced tea, when they forget I'm a reporter, they will say this. They will crack racist jokes. They will insist Obama is a Muslim, a socialist, and a Nazi. These are not Republicans necessarily. In fact, many of these people have voted Democratic their entire lives. So even some liberals who may appear to be post-racial in public might be fairly prejudiced in private spaces. For these reasons, liberals might underestimate the extent of anti-Black attitudes in society. It's important that liberals recognize the polarization and segmentation of the society. Just because their liberal friends may not be expressing prejudicial attitudes, that does not mean that no one has them. It is useful for liberals to focus not simply on their own social circles, but on the broader national picture. It is also useful for liberals to find ways to break out of their bubbles. The algorithms behind social media are designed to find the things that we like and to feed us more and more of it. We never have to engage with any disagreeable information. While this helps social media companies, it really does not help build an appreciation and understanding of our differences. We all have to make conscious efforts to be aware of what's going on in society as a whole, not simply with what's going on with the people most similar to us. A problem that disproportionately affects conservatives is what I call the white victimhood mentality. Some conservative politicians and some in the conservative media have pushed the idea that white people are the major victims of discrimination in society. And one person captures it pretty well and states, a lot of white people honestly think they have been significantly deprived of various things because of minorities. And it's hard to overstate how deeply these feelings run. It's not so much animosity towards people who are different, It's the animosity of the aggrieved. They feel like they are victims. And I can give you a couple examples of these statements. So one states, I'm a white male that was born and raised in this country, and my parents were, and their parents, etc. I cannot find a job I'm qualified for, nor can I get a free education because someone else's accent or skin tone needs to be addressed before mine and other whites like myself. And the funny part is that I'm the minority now, not Mr. Obama and other non-Caucasian racial people in this country. Another statement, it's completely crazy. The inmates, meaning people of color, the inmates are running the asylum. They're completely in power, and they get anything they want. And us regular, normal white guys, we're like nothing. We don't count for shit anymore. So those are examples of that mentality, and it's really difficult for me to understand because in all social economic measures, the average white person is better off than the average African American, average Latino. You see that in income, wealth, poverty rates, etc. In terms of political power, it is also true. In 2014, there was an analysis of all federal, state, and county elected officials, and that analysis found that 90% of all of our elected officials were white. At that time in 2014, the non-Latino white population was 62%. So I don't really understand that sort of well, basically there's no real factual basis driving that mentality. Having said that, I think it's both legitimate and important to speak about the hardships faced by the white working class and the white poor. But it is not legitimate to have that discussion while pretending that people of color are not also disproportionately working class and poor. We have to insist that both conservatives and liberals engage with the facts about the broad realities of American society. We can't let people make things up and then base their politics on it. We have to challenge these fictions. So Americans are blinded to the racism in society because they want to feel proud in their American identities. To address this challenge, we have to point out that we are celebrating American ideals when we fight racism. People find it hard to see and understand institutional discrimination. We have to try harder to discuss institutional discrimination while using case studies. Liberals and conservatives are in bubbles that give them a distorted picture of the country. We have to encourage them to take some time to engage with the whole country, not just people who think like they do. We cannot create a more perfect union if Americans are repeatedly deluding themselves into thinking the problem of racism has been solved when it has not. It can be painful to admit that our country is far from perfect and to look at our problems squarely. But we have to communicate that only when we examine the facts, face our problems, and work to address them, do we come closer to creating a country of real equality, freedom, and opportunity for all. Thank you. Yes, I would be happy to.
If you could raise your hand, we'll bring a mic to you. Thank you.
Hi. Near the end, you said people cannot make up their facts and then base their politics around them. When you have the leader of the country currently doing just that, I guess how difficult is it to maintain a positive attitude towards all this and see some relatively soon future changes?
Yes, so it is extremely difficult. We're in a terrible situation, and unfortunately, these are the cards that we're dealt with. So I think it's of course more important that we have these fights over what is and is not factual. And I don't know if people followed it, but there was an attempted sting of the Washington Post around the Roy Moore allegations, where this you can look it up on the Washington Post, but the Washington Post took that sting up to really explain to the people what journalists do. That they fact check, that they look at the backstory, that they look for corroborating evidence. And that was really wonderful. It's unfortunate that people assume that the Washington Post, one of our major newspapers, might be making things up. But nonetheless, they took that attack at the Post and at the press generally to strengthen their position and to educate people about what is it that journalists do and what is real reporting versus a political attack and political propaganda. So it's a terrible situation that we're in, but we don't get to choose. We just have to live in this, and it's more important that we fight over what is and what isn't a fact, and what is and what isn't true.
I'd like your opinion on the cons of Brown versus Board of Education. We speak of the pros, but I think much more can be learned by the cons of Brown versus Board of Education. Could you give a comment or something?
Well, I feel like you have specific ideas of what the cons are, so maybe you should tell us what you think of the cons. So this is a...
Education. I think my opinion, no facts, no stats, no anything. I just feel that it was great for the time, but it has impacted education for people of color and for people with special needs in such a negative manner. And as you're mentioning, everyone thinks America's great. Well, I'm Minnesotan. I'm not. I live here. But Minnesota has the great, everyone has education on their head, but guess what? We're having issues. So, and I think it is probably one reason the Brown versus Board of Education, because there were so many brilliant people when they were integrated that were positive and out there, and we're not having that.
Okay, I think I understand your what you're getting at and what you're tapping into. And yes, I think that with all policies, there are positives and negatives. And I think it's important to keep in mind, well, why did we set these laws to segregate schools? And what the Brown decision and around it really highlighted, that I think it's important that we do not forget, is the idea of separate and unequal education. That was true then, and unfortunately is still true today. And the reason why you have racially separate schools and school districts and communities is precisely because you plan to treat them differently. right? Because if you're really going to provide the same things, the same opportunities, if you're really going to be equitable, you don't need to segregate, right? So I think it's really important that we recognize that this separation leads to unequal resources and educational inequities. On the other hand, I know that people, there is a challenge. So when you're thinking about the issue of integration, there is a challenge. Reading, again, Richard Rothstein's book, you see this clearly. The pioneers, the first African Americans who were trying to integrate these communities, tremendous hostility, tremendous attacks. I mean, homes bombed, it's a real cost. So on the one hand, integration, you have the potential access to a tremendous amount of resources, but you also can get more exposure to racial prejudice and discrimination, and that's one of the challenges. So, but again, I do think we have to look at the resources and the opportunities that come from it. So yes, it's not a simple. If we're being honest, it's not like there's all positive and no negatives. But I think a case can be made that the positives outweigh the negatives, at least in the long term, for those initial families trying to integrate those communities. Those were some very serious negatives. But I think in the long term, for the more perfect union that we're trying to build, it's an important a step.
Hello. I'm not 100% sure how to frame this, but as America tries to become a more compassionate nation, there has been reported the possibility of hundreds of millions of dollars being circulated by a small and select group of very wealthy individuals over the past several decades in an attempt to promote what formerly were considered fringe of fringe ideas into these are far right-wing ideas that are trying to be, they're attempting to permeate the American society with these. How do you feel that, what's your opinion of that?
Well, so I currently work for an organization called DEMOS, and DEMOS, our tagline is an equal say for all and an equal chance for all. And an equal say, we're referring to an equal say in our politics and an equal chance in our economy. So we focus on issues of money in politics precisely for what you're saying. It's not democratic to have a small group of very wealthy people to have a disproportionate voice and disproportionate influence over our politics. So DEMOS champions sort of campaign finance reform that will get more people involved, get more people voting, so that we don't have a country that's led by a few wealthy individuals, but really have a true, robust democracy where everyone participates and everyone has an equal say in what happens politically. So yes, that is a serious problem, particularly at this point of very high income and wealth inequality. So because the richest Americans, and particularly the richest 1%, are so much richer, their economic power, which they can translate to some degree into political power, is constantly growing. So it is a serious concern, and that's why we need an equal say for all and an equal chance for all in the economy. Yeah, that's an important point.
Hello, Dr. Alston. It's a pleasure to hear you in person today, present the facts that you've presented today. And my question is, first of all, I would say that many of the comments that were made by those who say that this is a post-racial era, I would consider those to be, many of them to be red herrings. And the fact of the matter is, when we look at the statistics and we hear things such as Minnesota, #1, was named as the best run state because of its low unemployment rate as well as low poverty, you would also have to ask the question, though, who are the beneficiaries? So when I think in terms of the post-racial, I disagree with that it is not a post-racial. But I also like to ask you the question, how much of an impact do you believe those same attitudes are having up on the disparities that we are addressing today?
Yes, so that's precisely the case, because once you believe that we're post-racial, then you don't see the racial and ethnic disparities, and you don't feel that you need to address it. So yes, that's precisely the point, that we need to highlight these things, we need to draw more attention to them, and we need to work to build a commitment to address them. Yes. I think this gentleman over here had a question. Mm-hmm.
Just only my question. Thank you very much first for you sharing all those things today and this event. And my question is, and how political powers are change human rights. And you know, like testimony we see last night for the victory at Dr. John's at the Alabama, and 21st. You know, actually is I was so happy. Please. And we was 20 years, and you know, the people are the human rights fighting was successful last night for the victory. And thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm not sure what the question is, but yeah, I do think that you know, in terms of the election, I do think, I'm going to go back to the point that I just made, that it's wonderful, like if we're committed to democracy, we really should be trying to build systems and establish policies that increase participation in our elections. So one thing that we saw in that election was particularly high African American turnout, and that's a wonderful thing. We should, as a country, we should be saying, yes, we want everyone to participate in elections. I talked about with the historic Obama election, we had 57%. That is not, we should not be happy with 50% of the voting age population voting. We should be really pushing to try to get 100%. And that's a problem. If we are Democrats, we need to work on that and have more people participate. And then we get leaders who actually represent the people, not represent, you know, some slice of the population. Yes.
We have time for one more question.
Mm-hmm.
You spoke of conservatives and liberals living in their respective bubbles, which is true. And whereas in the past it might have been reinforced by intentional and unintentional geographic isolation, today it's reinforced by social media, 24/7 cable news, politics, which seeks to target and divide. And how do we get out of that downward spiral? I mean, how do we, it's down the rabbit hole, how do we get out of it?
Yeah, so I think we need to be much more savvy. We need to, you know, frankly, I think we need media education in our schools, including social media, so people know, one, what do journalists do, getting back to a prior point of mine, but also understand social media, because I think that many people, there are millions of people on the different social media platforms, and people do not realize that there are programs behind their feeds that are determining what they don't and don't see, and that they do not have any control over those programs. And I think once people have that awareness, we can be somewhat more critical in our consumption, in our use of that media, and maybe use it a little less, use it a little more strategically. So I think it's really important as first steps for people like yourself and other people in the room to really just make sure that all of your friends realize that there are algorithms really trying to manipulate our media feed, trying to keep us on as much as possible, trying to essentially get us addicted to social media. And there's research that's showing, particularly for young people, it may have particularly negative effects. So we really have to be smarter users and consumers of social media. Okay. So thank you again. Thank you.